The first sign that something was wrong wasn't my mother-in-law standing on the porch with my suitcase. It was the fact that my house key no longer fit the lock. I stood there in the July heat outside our home in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, my 6-day-old daughter sleeping against my chest, while my husband unloaded the car as if nothing unusual had happened. Fresh-cut grass drifted across the neighborhood, and somewhere down the street, a dog barked behind a screen door. I tried the key again, slower this time. Nothing. "Eric," I said, shifting the baby in my arms. "Why isn't this working?" He froze for half a second before setting down the diaper bag. "Mom changed the locks." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. 30 hours of labor, 6 sleepless nights in the hospital, and enough pain medication to make anyone foggy-headed, surely. There had to be another explanation. She did what? Before Eric could answer, the front door opened. My mother-in-law, Patricia, stepped onto the porch carrying my overnight bag. She looked as put together as she always did for Sunday service. Pressed blouse, silver cross around her neck, not a hair out of place. "I figured we'd better talk outside," she said. The baby stirred. My back ached so badly that standing felt like work. I glanced past Patricia into the house, expecting her to move aside. She didn't. "Talk about what?" Patricia set my suitcase beside the porch swing. Eric and I had bought at a yard sale 3 summers earlier. "Well, Claire, you've had a rough time lately." "We all have." I looked at Eric. "What's she talking about?" He shoved his hands into his pockets and stared at the gravel driveway. My stomach tightened. Over the past month, little things had started adding up. Patricia insisting on coming to every doctor's appointment. Eric suddenly handling our bank statements. Whispered conversations that stopped whenever I entered the room. I'd let those things pass because I was focused on bringing our daughter into the world. Now, standing on my own porch in hospital slippers, I wished I hadn't. Patricia folded her arms. "Eric needs stability right now. A newborn changes things. We think it'd be best if you stayed with your mother for a while." "We?" The word hit me harder than the July heat. I laughed once, quietly. "You can't be serious." Patricia's face never changed. "Well, I'll tell you what. There's no room in this house for a useless wife and a screaming baby." I waited for Eric to tell her she'd gone too far. Instead, he said, "Claire, please don't make this difficult." He had some nerve. I reached into the car for my purse and froze. My wallet, my checkbook, Emma's hospital. For a moment, I couldn't answer my mother. I stood in the driveway with Emma asleep against my shoulder, staring at the house my grandmother's money had helped us buy, while Eric and Patricia disappeared inside without another word. The screen door slammed shut, and a few seconds later, I heard the deadbolt click. "Claire?" my mother asked again. "Honey, are you there?" I swallowed hard. "Mom, they changed the locks." There was silence on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of a kitchen chair scraping across the floor. My mother, Dorothy, had lived alone in western Kentucky since my father passed away 6 years earlier. She wasn't the sort of woman who panicked. She had spent 40 years teaching, 3rd grade and another 10 caring for my grandmother. If anything, trouble only made her quieter. "Tell me exactly what happened," she said. As I explained, she didn't interrupt. She didn't gasp when I told her Patricia had called me useless. And she didn't curse Eric's name when I admitted he'd stood there and let it happen. When I finished, she asked a question I wasn't expecting. "Do you have your purse?" I looked into the back seat. "No." "Your checkbook?" "No." "The baby's paperwork?" My stomach dropped. "That's inside too." My mother let out a slow breath. "That ain't right. Then," she asked the question that had been haunting her since morning. "Claire, did Eric mention meeting with an attorney?" I frowned. "What attorney?" "My friend Linda saw him leaving an attorney's office in town 2 weeks ago." She didn't think much of it at the time, but she called me this afternoon after hearing you'd gone into labor. I glanced back at the house. The curtains in the living room shifted for a moment, then went still. Someone inside was watching me. "Mom, I don't understand any of this." "Maybe you don't yet," she replied. "But we're going to." Less than an hour later, her old blue pickup rolled into the driveway. She climbed out carrying a thermos of coffee and a small overnight bag. The sun was beginning to set, painting the neighborhood in shades of orange and gold. She took one look at my face, then at the locked front door and shook her head. "Bless his heart," she muttered. "Your husband thinks he's got everything figured out." She reached for Emma, who immediately settled into her grandmother's arms, and together we walked toward my car. That's when my mother stopped beside the mailbox. A large envelope was sticking halfway out. Across the top, in black letters, was the name of a law firm from Nashville. My mother opened it under the porch light, scanned the first page, and suddenly went pale. "Claire," she whispered, handing me the papers. "I think your marriage ended before your daughter was even born." My hand shook as I took the envelope from my mother. Emma was asleep in her arms, wrapped in the yellow blanket my aunt had sewn months before, completely unaware that her parents' marriage was falling apart in the driveway behind her. Under the glow of the porch light, I looked down at the first page and felt the blood drain from my face. The documents had been filed nearly 2 weeks earlier, before my labor, before Eric held my hand in the delivery room, before he smiled for photographs with our daughter in his arms. He had already petitioned for divorce. I read the date again, hoping I had misunderstood, but the numbers didn't change. Eric had planned this long before I ever came home from the hospital. "Get in the car," my mother said quietly. "We'll figure this out in the morning." I looked back at the house one last time. The curtains moved just enough for me to know someone was standing there, watching us leave. We drove 40 miles to my uncle's farmhouse outside Bowling Green, Kentucky. Rain began falling halfway there, tapping against the windshield while Emma slept in the back seat. I barely slept that night. Every time the baby cried, my mind returned to the envelope sitting on the kitchen table downstairs. Just after sunrise, my mother poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs and spread the papers across the table. "Something doesn't add up," she said. "Eric always depended on you to keep track of the bills. He couldn't have done all this alone." I wanted to argue, but deep down I knew she was right. Over the years, I'd managed almost everything. Our mortgage payments, our insurance, our taxes. Eric worked hard, but paperwork wasn't his strength. Someone had helped him. By 10 o'clock, we were sitting inside the county courthouse, waiting to request copies of the divorce filing. The old building smelled of dust and worn paper, and the ceiling fan above the clerk's desk clicked softly as people lined up to pay taxes and file permits. A gray-haired clerk disappeared into the records room and returned with a thick folder. "Ma'am," she said, sliding it across the counter. "There's more in here than a divorce petition." My mother and I exchanged a look before opening it. Inside were requests for temporary possession of the house, sole access to our joint bank account, and primary custody of Emma. But what stopped me cold was Eric's written statement claiming that I was emotionally unstable after childbirth and incapable of caring for my daughter without supervision. I stared at the page in disbelief. "He actually filed this?" I asked. The clerk nodded sympathetically. "I'm afraid he did." My mother folded the papers and reached into her purse. "Then it's a good thing I made a phone call last night." She handed me a business card. Printed across the top in neat gold letters was a name I hadn't seen in years, Margaret Holloway. And there was one thing my mother still hadn't told me about her. Card over in my hands as my mother drove us across town. Margaret Holloway. I knew the name immediately. 10 years earlier, after my grandfather died, she had handled his estate and helped my grandmother sort through stacks of deeds, tax forms, and insurance papers. Back then, I was too young to pay much attention to what happened in her office. Now, as we parked outside the red brick building across from the courthouse, I had a feeling those old papers mattered more than I ever realized. Margaret greeted us herself. She was in her 70s, with silver hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. Her office smelled of old books and coffee, and framed photographs of local families covered the walls. She looked at Emma sleeping in her carrier and then at me. "Claire," she said softly, "I wish we were meeting again under better circumstances." We sat down, and before I could ask a question, my mother placed the divorce papers on Margaret's desk. The attorney adjusted her glasses and read quietly for several minutes. She didn't look surprised. In fact, she looked almost disappointed, as though she had been expecting something like this for a long time. Finally, she opened a filing cabinet and removed a thick manila folder with my grandmother's name written across the front. "Your grandmother was a careful woman," she said. "She loved Eric well enough, but she never completely trusted Patricia." I leaned forward. "What does that have to do with any of this?" Margaret slid several documents across the desk. 3 years ago, when your grandmother passed away, she left you $75,000. 40,000 of that went toward the down payment on your home. I nodded. That part wasn't new to me. What came next was, What you didn't know, Margaret continued, is that your grandmother insisted on a separate property agreement before the money was transferred. She pointed to a paragraph near the bottom of the page. The document clearly stated that the inheritance remained legally mine and that any contribution it made to the house could not be claimed by Eric in the event of a divorce. If I was ever forced out of the property unfairly, I had the right to recover my share in full. For the first time since leaving the hospital, I felt the ground steady beneath my feet. Eric and Patricia had spent weeks convincing themselves that I was powerless. They had changed the locks, frozen me out, and tried to paint me as an unstable new mother. But they had overlooked something important. My grandmother had planned ahead. Margaret wasn't finished. She opened another folder and placed several bank statements on the desk. "Claire, I need to ask you something," she said. "Did you authorize anyone else to access your joint account?" "No," I answered immediately. Margaret turned the paperwork around. Beneath Eric's signature, added 6 months earlier, was another name. Patricia Dawson. My mother stared at the page. "I'll be darned," she whispered. Then Margaret pointed to one final transaction, made just 3 days before Emma was born, and suddenly everything changed. For a long moment, none of us said a word. I stared at the bank statement while Emma slept peacefully in her carrier beside Margaret's desk. 3 days before I gave birth, $25,000 had been transferred from our joint account into a new account bearing only 2 names, Eric Dawson and Patricia Dawson. My hands went cold. That money included part of my inheritance, the savings I had built from years of working at the elementary school library, and the emergency fund Eric and I had promised never to touch, without discussing it first. "Can they do this?" I asked quietly. Margaret removed her glasses and folded her hands on the desk. "Whether they can keep it is another matter." "Entirely." My mother leaned back in her chair and shook her head. This wasn't some argument that got out of hand. They planned every bit of it. Looking back, I realized she was right. Patricia insisting on attending every doctor's appointment. Eric suddenly taking an interest in our finances after years of leaving them to me. The whispered conversations that stopped whenever I entered the room. It all fit together now. They hadn't decided to push me out after Emma was born. They had been preparing for it for months. Margaret filed emergency motions that very afternoon. She requested immediate access to the house, the restoration of my bank privileges, and an injunction preventing further transfers. 2 weeks later, we gathered in the county courthouse. The room was small, with old wooden benches polished by decades of use. Outside, pickup trucks lined the square, and the church bells down the street marked the hour. Eric sat beside Patricia at the opposite table. For the first time since I had left the hospital, he looked nervous. Patricia, however, still wore the calm expression she had carried the day she locked me out. Eric's attorney argued that I was emotionally unstable after childbirth and unable to manage our finances or care for Emma on my own. He described me as dependent, overwhelmed, and unfit to make important decisions. I listened without interrupting. I've seen enough in my life to know that the truth doesn't get louder when people lie. It simply waits its turn. Then Margaret stood. One by one, she presented the documents. The inheritance agreement. The mortgage records proving that my grandmother's money had purchased most of the house. The bank statements showing Patricia's unauthorized access. Finally, she handed the judge the transfer records and a series of text messages that investigators had recovered from Eric's phone. One message from Patricia read, "Wait until the baby comes home. It'll be easier then." Another, sent by Eric just days before Emma's birth, simply said, "Once she's out, the house is ours." The courtroom fell silent. Eric stared at the table. Patricia's expression cracked for the first time all morning. The judge adjusted his glasses and read the messages twice. By the end of the hearing, the court ordered the money returned, restored my access to the house, and denied Eric's request for custody. The divorce continued for months, but the outcome was already clear. Word traveled quickly through our town. Patricia quietly stepped down from her church committee. Neighbors who had once praised Eric began keeping their distance. No one shouted at them or ran them out of town. Folks simply stopped trusting them. As for me, I moved back into the house with Emma. On warm evenings, after putting her to bed, I would sit alone on the porch swing with a glass of sweet tea and listen to the crickets beyond the yard. Sometimes I'd think about that afternoon, when I came home from the hospital and found the locks changed, They thought becoming a mother would make me easier to control. Instead, it taught me exactly what I was willing to fight for. And in the end, the people who tried to take my home lost something far more valuable, the respect of everyone around them.